Happy days are here again. The skies above are clear again. Oh, hello everyone. It's me, Mr. Macaluso, and today I'm here to talk to you about Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. This is one of my favorite topics. I think it's a really important topic. As I mentioned this morning in our little class meeting, I feel like we are living in an era that is very similar to the era of the New Deal. The country faced a huge crisis, the Great Depression, one of the largest crises since the Civil War. And in 1932, the country elected Franklin Roosevelt to lead us out of that crisis. Franklin Roosevelt, the cousin of Teddy Roosevelt, brought the New Deal to America, which is going to fundamentally change the way the U.S. government interacts with the U.S. citizenry. A couple things about Franklin Roosevelt. As I said, he was Teddy Roosevelt's cousin. He was born into a very, very wealthy family. And in his early life, he looked more like a playboy than a real serious leader. He was born into a world of privilege. He grew up on an estate in the Hudson River Valley. But in his early 20s, he contracted polio. Now, for those of you who don't know, polio was a really, really scary disease that was a problem in the United States up until the 1950s. And certain years prior to the 1950s would see huge outbreaks of this terrible disease. And the disease was so bad that, for Franklin Roosevelt, it left him paralyzed from the waist down. Other people had to live the rest of their lives in this contraption called an iron lung, which was the only way to allow people to breathe, because basically their diaphragm was paralyzed by this virus, the polio virus. Okay, there was a vaccine created in the 1950s by Jonas Salk, and that has basically eradicated polio from much of the earth. Okay, although there are outbreaks from time to time. So that's something that most of you probably don't even know about, but it affected Franklin Roosevelt, and most historians and his biographers say that the crisis for Franklin Roosevelt of dealing with the fact that he was going to be paralyzed for the rest of his life, he was never going to walk unaided again, really brought out the mettle in Franklin Roosevelt and gave him the kind of optimistic, buoyant personality that you see here in this kind of iconic photograph of him that helped the United States not only through the Great Depression, but through World War II. Franklin Roosevelt was elected 4 different times. He died in his 4th term. He was elected in 1940, so that stands to reason. He actually died in 1945. His 4th term was in 1944. But anyway, Franklin Roosevelt has just a huge, huge impact on American politics. You probably are familiar with this quote of his: "Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself." You can tell that I like Franklin Roosevelt. I kind of grew up, I would say, kind of in the shadow of Franklin Roosevelt. I just felt, when I was growing up, the Depression and World War II were still things that, my grandparents remembered, and Franklin Roosevelt, I think, was a hero to them. So that's always made an impression on me. So let's talk about it. Franklin Roosevelt. He's elected in 1932. It's a landslide for the Democrats, 1932. As I said in my last lecture, Herbert Hoover, super qualified man, probably the most qualified person to ever be elected president, but he had this kind of ideological stance that made it really, really hard for him to deal with the Great Depression. He just didn't want to use the federal government on a large scale to help individuals because he felt it was going to ruin their souls. The Democrats obviously are going to use that against him in the campaign in 1932, and they win big. They extend their majority in the House by winning 93 new seats. That's a huge, huge, huge victory. So they now have a majority of 313 seats to 117 Republican seats. FDR, I don't know why that went backwards, but FDR wins 472 electoral votes. He carries all but 7 states. Now, this is interesting. Look at the Republican states in 1932. They're Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. You would be surprised that those New England states are so Republican back then, but that is the case. The Senate. The Democrats win back the Senate for the first time since that midterm election in 1918 that Woodrow Wilson botched. They win 12 seats in the Senate, and now they have a majority. There is 58 Democrats in the Senate, plus one Farmer Labor Party, which will caucus, that is, vote with the Democrats most of the time. Okay, so Franklin Roosevelt is firmly in charge. And when he comes to power, he announces the New Deal. That was actually what he campaigned on, this thing he called the New Deal. Remember, Teddy Roosevelt had the Square Deal. This is the New Deal. And the New Deal consists of what he calls the 3 R's. Okay? I'll explain what those are in a second. But when he's inaugurated, and back then you were still inaugurated in March. He's inaugurated, I think, March 4th. And on March 6th, he calls Congress into a special session. This is one of the powers of the presidency that we didn't go over when we talked about the Constitution. But he calls Congress into session because he wants them to act immediately. And during the first 100 days of that Congress does something that it normally never does. It actually passes dozens and dozens of bills. Okay? Some people criticize this 100 days Congress because it was as if Congress was just rubber stamping anything that FDR wanted. Okay, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, we call him FDR. If he asked Congress to do something, they did it. They realized that they had gotten into Congress on his coattails. That is, people elected them because they were voting for Franklin Roosevelt. Okay, so the 3 R's that we see emerge in the 100 Days Congress are these. First one is relief. The idea is to give immediate relief to people who are suffering from the Great Depression. Remember, 25% of the population, of the working population, is unemployed. Those people have been unemployed since 1929 or 1930, and they need money to feed their family, or they need food to feed their family. And so think about it today. Recently, Congress has sent out relief checks to people who have become unemployed because of the pandemic. Congress has spent trillions of dollars doing that. And, families have gotten, checks for $1,200 per adult, per working adult, which seems like a lot of money. It's helpful, but it's certainly not going to get you through the whole year. But, a lot of people were helped by that relief. Congress does the same thing in 1933. The next R is reform. So the Great Depression was really caused by a lot of banking problems, right? So remember, Woodrow Wilson tried to take on the banks. He created the Federal Reserve System. FDR still sees problems with the banks, the way they do business, the risky policies that they have, and he wants to reform that, as well as other things in the financial world. And recovery. So this is a massive depression, and you can't just turn a switch to make the economy work again. FDR wants to use what we call fiscal stimulus to get things working again. You remember what fiscal policy is. It's when the government taxes, borrows, and spends. FDR is going to borrow a ton of money, and he's going to spend that money to get Americans working again. Because if you're working, you're making money, which means you're then going to spend money, and that'll help get businesses going again. Okay, so those are the 3 R's. The first thing I want to talk about is the Emergency Banking Relief Act. This is passed in 6 hours on, I think it was March 6, 1933, just 2 days after FDR took office, the day that he calls Congress into special session. Imagine this is a very complicated act, and it's passed in 6 days. That is crazy. Okay, so it's his second day in office. First thing he does is he calls for a bank holiday. Now, this isn't part of the act, but it goes hand in hand with the act. A bank holiday is this. He is going to close every single bank in the United States for 8 days. Okay. Now that you could ask if he even has the power to do that, but because this is such an intense emergency, he just goes ahead and does it anyway. Here's the deal. Thousands of banks are closing every year. In fact, since 1932, 9,000 banks have closed already. What does that mean for people who have deposited their money in a bank? That means that they may have lost all that money. That's right. If you put $1,000 in the bank and that bank went bankrupt, you never saw your money again. Imagine how terrible, how devastating that would be. That's continuing to happen, so FDR decides he is going to put a halt to that. He closes all the banks. This is important. Imagine if, imagine what happens when you close the bank. People can't take their money out of the bank. Therefore, there can't be any runs on the banks, right? So, you've seen this before. We saw it when we watched Mary Poppins, right? People are afraid that their bank is about to go bankrupt, so they all rush to their bank to get their money out. And when everyone rushes to the bank at the same time, what happens to the bank? It goes bankrupt, even if it's a healthy bank. So FDR is going to close the bank for 8 days. In the meantime, the federal government will audit all of the banks. That means the government is going to go and look at the books of all the banks. And if a bank is weak, that is, if it's insolvent and unable to pay its depositors, the U.S. government will shut that bank down. Okay? Now that seems harsh, but on the other hand, if your bank is strong, the government will keep you open. Okay, now remember what I just said a moment ago. Even if your bank is strong, if everyone decides that they should be worried about it, they can run to that bank and take their money out, and that bank will collapse. The banking holiday, along with the audit, is designed to give the public the reassurance that the strong banks are strong. Yes, it's getting rid of the weak banks. Think of it this way. It's like if I have gangrene on my arm, what do I need to do to save my arm? I need to cut off the gangrenous part and save the healthy part. If I don't cut off the gangrenous part, what happens to my entire arm? I lose it all. Okay? So FDR is just getting rid of these weak banks. Now here's what the Emergency Banking Relief Act does. It's passed during this bank holiday, and part of it is called the Glass-Steagall Banking Reform Act, which creates the FDIC. I think you've all heard that acronym, FDIC. It stands for the Federal Depositors Insurance Corporation. Here's what it does. It insures your deposit in a bank up to $5,000 per bank. That's in 1933. Okay, today it's actually up to $250,000. So think about this. If I deposit $250,000 in a bank, not likely, but if I did, and that bank went bankrupt, I would get my money back. The federal government would have insured that deposit. If that's the case, do I ever have to rush to the bank to get my money out, even if I think the bank is going to close? I don't, because I know I'll get my money back. So what does the FDIC do? It prevents bank panics. Okay? So it's created in 1933, and when it's still around today, it was a major, major tool that prevented a Great Depression in 2008. Okay? So it's a really important thing. You would call this reform, right? This is one of the ways Franklin Roosevelt's going to reform the banking system. Okay, now, normally I would spend a lot of time on this in class. This would take 20, 25 minutes for me to explain. I'm trying to do it really quick today. Imagine how hard it would be for Franklin Roosevelt to explain all this to the American public. After all, you normally have to take a test, so you pay attention to me. I say this often in class, but do you really pay attention to what's going on in the news on a daily basis? And even if you kind of know what's going on, are you paying attention to the details? Usually you're not. So here's what FDR does, and this is a novel thing that he does. He gives what's called a fireside chat. So in his first week in office, he gives his first fireside chat. Now, this is a conversation with the American public that he gives over the radio. Now, the radio is a pretty new piece of technology. And Franklin Roosevelt is the first president to really use this technology to talk directly to the American people. In that way, it's kind of like his cousin's use of what he called the bully pulpit. Remember, Teddy Roosevelt went directly to the American people to try to get them on his side and try to get Congress to listen to him. Franklin Roosevelt is now using the radio to do that. And think about how that medium is different than previous modes of communication for politicians. In the past, politicians used to get up on a stump or on some sort of pulpit and talk to a large crowd, right? So I want you to imagine this. Imagine your most complicated class, calculus or physics. And imagine your teacher trying to teach the complicated things he or she teaches you in a huge, huge auditorium with 2,000 people. Would that be easy? Probably not. I think people are more able to understand you if you're talking kind of the way I'm talking to you right now. You don't have to use a large, booming voice so that everyone in the room can hear you. You just need to talk like this, as if I'm in your living room or sitting next to your fire. In fact, maybe that's how you've been listening to my lectures the last 2 months. Have you been sitting next to your fireside? Well, that's the way FDR wants it to seem like. And so he's going to reach 35 million listeners on his first fireside chat. Kind of amazing. Here it is.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States. My friends, I want to talk for a few minutes with the people of the United States about banking. To talk with the comparatively few who understand the mechanics of banking, but more particularly with the overwhelming majority of you who use banks for the making of deposits and the drawing of checks. I want to tell you what has been done.
Okay, now we're not going to listen to the whole thing, although you can look that up online and listen to it. Here's the thing, it works. The day that the bank holiday is over, for the first time since 1929, deposits start flooding into banks. That is, Franklin Roosevelt has told people, you can trust the banks. What have we done with the weak banks? We closed them. All the banks that are open are strong. If you put your money in the bank and the bank does close, the FDIC will insure your deposit. People start redepositing their money. You've probably all heard of the idea that during the Depression, people were hiding their money underneath their mattresses. That was true. People didn't trust banks, so they kept their money at home. I don't know if they hid it under their mattress, but that was the kind of the common conception of that. And all of a sudden, money starts going into banks. Now, think about this. Is that step one to revive the economy? Do you need money in banks? Of course. If you don't have money in banks, banks can't make out loans. And if people don't take out loans, they can't start new businesses. So the Emergency Banking Relief Act is the very first part of the New Deal, and it is overwhelmingly successful. Okay? Next, we're going to talk about a handful of New Deal programs which were intended to prime the pump. Okay, I put that in quotes. I don't know how many of you have ever used a water pump, but if you have, like if you ever pumped out your pool or something like that, before you start a pump, you have to first put water in the chamber so you can create suction. So the idea of these New Deal programs is to put money in the economy to get the economy going again. Okay, these New Deal programs are often called the alphabet soup agencies because they almost all have a three-letter acronym. Okay, so let's talk about some of them. The first one, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC. Okay, pretty important program. So when the Depression hits, there's a huge unemployment problem. Okay, and we're seeing that today as well. Unemployment today is about 20% of the working population, which is pretty hard. But it's also pretty hard on young people, right? My older daughter, Sophia, she had a job at school. She had a job lined up for the summer, and now all those jobs are gone, right? She's bummed. She wants money. I am bummed because I want her to work, right? Whether you know this or not, learning how to work is an acquired skill. Okay, when you get your first job, it's going to be different than school, and all of a sudden you're going to realize, like, oh, there are all these things I have to do, otherwise I'll get fired, right? And fortunately, all of you will learn those lessons pretty quickly and pretty well. Some of you will not, and that will hurt. The problem here is this: with millions of young people not able to find jobs, there's a worry that this is a whole generation of people who will not learn the basic skills of how to work, how to get out of bed on time, how to look presentable, how to do a good job. So the government decides to create jobs for young people. Okay. Now, FDR, like his cousin Teddy, realizes that there are a lot of conservation projects that need to happen around the country. That is, things to conserve the natural environment. Okay, so a lot of CCC jobs have to do with national parks. In fact, if you ever go hiking in a national park, and I hope you do, the trail that you hike was probably originally built by Civilian Conservation Corps workers. Okay, so you get trail building, you get lodges built. If you ever go to like Yellowstone National Park, they have these beautiful lodges, and a lot of them were first started by CCC jobs. A lot of the ski resorts in New England were first created by CCC jobs. Now, these don't seem like essential jobs, right? Like, the country doesn't have to have new hiking trails. But FDR realizes that doesn't matter. This is good for the country. It's an investment for the future, and it's an investment in these young people. Okay. They don't just build trails and lodges. They also do some soil conservation projects and things like that. Now, the deal here is this: if you get a CCC job, you go out and live probably somewhere in the countryside, near a national park. You live in a barracks with other people. You get 3 square meals a day, which is great during the Depression when you were probably hungry before. You get paid, but you have to send most of your salary home to your parents. So think about the 3 R's here. Is it relief? Yes, it's giving people jobs. Is it reform? Kind of. There's some environmental reforms, you could say. Is it recovery? Sure, it's helping your family get back on its feet again. It's also teaching young men how to work. Now, I say young men, girls were not allowed, girls were not included. The camps that were created were segregated. Okay, so of course there's still problems here, but it's a step in the right direction. I just read an editorial in the newspaper this morning saying we need a new CCC, right? There are plenty of environmental problems in this country today, and there are plenty of unemployed people today, and we need to get those people back to work. Wouldn't you like a job in the CCC? I know I would. If someone said, hey, you're going to go build trails in the Sierra Nevadas this summer, I'd be all for it. Okay, so that's the CCC. The Federal Emergency Relief Act. This is going to give $3 billion to states, and those states are going to use that money to pay unemployment benefits to people and for their own relief projects. So this is the first time that the U.S. government's going to give money to individuals so that they can survive. Okay, does the government do that today? Of course it does. Okay, the next one, the AAA, or the Agricultural Relief Act. Someone wrote a paper on this year, so they could whoever that person was, I forget who it was, could probably say a lot more about this. This is an act that gives subsidies to farmers. It's very controversial at the time. There was a lot of starving people in America, and this act is actually paying farmers not to farm. Why would you do that? Well, one of the problems with the economy is that farmers can't get enough money for their crops. The value of crops has gone way down. And because of that, what happened? That's called deflation. Farmers don't like deflation because what does it make it hard for them to do? It's hard for them to pay off their loans or their mortgages, right? So this is a way to save farmers. Okay, it's also a way of kind of managing the economy. If there's too much milk on the market, it's bad for farmers, so let's get farmers to stop producing that much milk. Okay, at the time, it's a lot of people are angry because it's reducing the amount of food out there, but it's not really about relief. It's about recovery to get farmers back on their feet again. There are a lot of issues with this bill. Our food system today is not very healthy, financially or nutritionally, and a lot of it has to do with these kind of government subsidies. It's a handout that the federal government gives to farmers, and a lot of people today would say it's not a very efficient way to do things. Anyway, let's move on. The WPA stands for the Works Progress Administration. And this is going to be money, about $11 billion, to build major government works. Things like dams, roads, airports. LaGuardia Airport in New York City was built with WPA money. Government buildings. So if you ever see government, courthouses that have kind of an Art Deco style, it was probably a WPA building. Dams like the Grand Coulee Dam on the Columbia River. The Hoover Dam was actually started by Hoover, but it's going to be continued by the WPA. So think about what these things do. They put people directly back to work. If you're hired as a construction worker on a dam, you're going to make pretty good money and you're going to be pretty busy. Okay? Those dams, they think, are also going to provide other economic development. Many of them are hydroelectric dams. That means cheap electricity. That means more factories can kind of spring up in that area. Today, actually, we look at all of the dams that were built during the Great Depression, at least I do, and I say ooh, those dams are actually really, really harmful to the environment. They've really hurt fish populations, fish that have to go upriver to spawn. Can't do that because of the dams. There's all sorts of issues with dams, but at the time, it seemed like a good idea. More programs. The NRA. This is not the National Rifle Association. This is the National Recovery Administration, and this is a government administration that sets minimum wages and maximum working hours. Okay? It's going to get ruled unconstitutional, but it's a first step towards making sure that labor, that is workers, get fair wages and fair working conditions and fair working hours. Okay. It also gives workers the right to collective bargain, that is to form unions so that they can try to bargain with management to get better pay. The TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority. Now, the Tennessee River runs not only in Tennessee, but also in Alabama, I think some other southern states. It eventually hits, the Tennessee River eventually goes into, I think, the Ohio and then into the Mississippi. It gets to the Mississippi at some point. But this river valley is in southern Appalachia. Now, southern Appalachia is one of the most poor areas of the country. So here's what the TVA is going to do. It's going to build dozens of hydroelectric dams on the Tennessee River. That is going to provide thousands of jobs. It's also going to bring electricity to a part of the country that didn't have electricity. Now remember, electricity is a pretty new, it's not new, but creating electricity utility or system is pretty new. It's only about 30 years old, but utilities, electric utilities, are private corporations. And private corporations don't want to build power plants or electrical grids for poor regions of the country because they don't think that those poor people can pay for their electricity. So imagine what that would mean. That would mean that if you lived in New York City, you had electricity. If you lived in Southern Appalachia, you had no electricity. Okay, it's kind of like the internet today, right? We all have access to the internet, but if you live in a really poor rural area, you probably don't have access to the internet. Imagine trying to live today without the internet, especially when we're in a pandemic and we're all going to school online. That would be really hard, and that would put you at a disadvantage. If the region you live in doesn't have electricity, no factory is going to locate itself in your region. So if you build hydroelectric power plants in Southern Appalachia, all of a sudden businesses might start moving to that region. It might also help that region have better hospitals, better schools, things like that. Okay, so the TVA is relief for this very poor region of the country. And it's also recovery. It's going to try to bring industry to that region. The last thing it's going to do is it's going to try to regulate public utilities, right? Ooh, let me go back. As I said, most electrical utilities are private corporations. Private corporations run to make a profit. But as we know from when we were looking at populism, electrical utilities are natural monopolies. That means they can charge whatever amount they want for electricity unless the government regulates it. Well, here's what the TVA will do. Now that the government is making electricity, it knows how much it costs to make electricity, and it can say to other utility companies, you can't charge more than this. Okay. On the other hand, what does that sound like to you? We have the government running a business. Sounds like socialism, yes? It is socialism. Okay. And private utility companies are going to say, this isn't fair. We can't compete with the government because the government is way more powerful. Okay. And we still have that argument today, and we still have that battle. Okay. So that's the TVA. Now, let's talk about probably the biggest and most important New Deal program of them all. It's still around today. It's considered to be the most successful government program ever, yet today this program is in trouble. Okay? Trouble that can be fixed. It remains to be seen whether we have the political will to fix it, though. Okay? The program I'm talking about is Social Security. In 1935, the Social Security Administration is created by Congress. And here's what it is. I think most of you probably know what it is, but it's a retirement pension for all workers. Okay, and here's how it works. People who are currently working, let's say we're in 1935 when this is passed. It goes into effect in 1936. If I have a job, the government is now going to tax me on my income. Back in 1935 or 1936, it's going to be a 2% tax on anything I make up to $3,000. Okay? And in fact, that tax is split evenly between the worker and the employer, right? So if GCS is paying me $3,000, I'm going to pay 1% of $3,000. What is 1% of $3,000? Anyone? Is it 30? I believe it's 30. I pay $30 and GCS pays $30, right? So I get my regular income of $3,000 minus $30, and then GCS pays another $30. That goes into a trust fund that the government runs. It uses that money to buy treasury bonds. Those bonds mature over time, and when I retire at the age of 65, the government will pay me a monthly pension for the rest of my life. It's not a lot of money, but it's enough money to keep me hopefully out of poverty. Okay? Now, back in the day, companies used to pay pensions as well. So maybe I would have had a pension from my employer, plus this government pension. Some people don't work for companies that pay pensions, and this might be the only money they have other than their savings. Okay. Today, 2020, we pay 12.4% on our income up to $128,000. So if I make $130,000, I don't pay anything on that last $2,000. Okay, and again, it's split between the employee and the employer. So I actually pay 6.2%, and good old Glenn Elk would pay another 6.2%. Okay, so this is a way to fund people's retirements. Okay, now if I were retired, if I were 65 in 1936, I would be really, really lucky. I would get the pension even though I hadn't paid into the system. The rest of us, we get paid in proportion to what we pay into the system. Okay, so my parents are in their 70s, and they get Social Security. Hopefully they have saved enough money to live on themselves, but sometimes hardship happens and you don't have enough money, and this is just a nice safety net. Okay. I said that there are problems with the Social Security Administration, and the problem is this. When the baby boom hits, I know you all think I'm a boomer, but I am not. The baby boom is a huge, huge cohort of people that are basically retiring right now. There were so many of them that they were paying a lot of money into the Social Security Fund. And that was great for the people who were already retired. But now as those boomers, as you like to derisively call them, as they retire, they are owed a lot of money from Social Security. But because they're such a large group, there's relatively fewer of us to pay into Social Security to support them. Okay, maybe this is why you are also bitter against the boomers, is that you're being taxed to help fund their retirement. Here's another big problem. Back in 1935, the life expectancy was not that much higher than 65. So I could retire at 65 and maybe I'd be dead by 68 or 69, and the government wouldn't really have to pay that much money for me. Today, you could retire at 65, and I think most upper middle class Americans are expected to live well into their 80s. So obviously that's a lot harder for the government to finance. So we need to reform the system in some way. Maybe it's to raise the tax. Maybe it's to raise the amount of money that can be taxed. Maybe it's to raise the age that you can retire. Although if I'm a carpenter banging nails my whole life, I probably want to retire at 65. I'm not sure what that is, but we need to figure that out soon. Guess when the Social Security Trust Fund is set to run out? Almost exactly the year that I turned 65. So I better start saving my nickels. Okay, anyway, that's the Social Security Administration. There's a fourth R, right? Outside of relief, reform, and recovery, FDR has a stealthy fourth R. And we see this in the election of 1936. Let's think about what FDR has been doing. He's been giving government services and money to just about everyone he can think of. Okay? Doesn't that sound a little bit like the spoils system? Except for Franklin Roosevelt, he gives money to everyone, whether you voted for him or not. What do you suppose that is going to encourage more and more Americans to do? More and more Americans are going to become Democrats. So the fourth R is what we call realignment. The New Deal is going to create a huge political coalition in the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is going to basically retain control of Congress almost continuously for the next 54 years or so. It's not until 1993 that Republicans kind of start winning Congress, control of Congress for consecutive terms. There were some years where Republicans won control of one house or another during all that time, but it was usually only for one election cycle. Okay? 1992, I guess, not 1993. 1992, there's an election where Republicans take control of the House and maybe the Senate. And since then, we've seen kind of a splintering of the New Deal Democratic coalition. Anyway, in 1936, FDR runs again for his second term, and he wins 523 to 8. Okay, that's the biggest landslide since, I think, James Monroe. The Republican Alf Landon won only Maine and Vermont. What is that? That's 6. Well, that must be, I guess that's 8, somehow 8 electoral votes. And in Congress, Democrats win a 2/3 majority in both the House and the Senate. I'm not sure we've seen that since the days of Andrew Johnson. Okay? Now, think about what that means. If you're Franklin Roosevelt, what have the people just given you? They've given you a mandate. You are very, very popular. You have what we call, do you remember the term? You have political capital. Okay? And when you have political capital, it seems like you can do whatever you want, right? Recently we haven't had presidents with a whole lot of political capital. George W. Bush famously won re-election in 2004, and he said, "I've won political capital and I intend to spend it." He was wrong. He won 51% of the vote in 2004. That's not a lot of capital. What did he try to do with that capital? He tried to reform Social Security. He wanted to reform it by privatizing it. How well did that work out for him? Not at all. They call Social Security the third rail of American politics for a reason. Old people who vote don't want anyone messing with their pension. So if you try to change it, they zap you. Okay? Third rail, like on a subway track, the third rail is the electrified rail. If you touch it, you get zapped. Let's talk more about this Democratic coalition. People in cities are going to love the Democratic Party because there are a lot of WPA projects in cities. The farmers love the AAA, right, which is seen as a Democratic program. So they're going to vote for the Democrats. African Americans, think about this. The Republican Party is the party of Lincoln. If African Americans actually had the right to vote, not many of them do, they would have voted for Republicans because of Lincoln. But the New Deal is giving them some amount of benefits. Disproportionately, they don't get as many benefits as white Americans. There's still a lot of racism in this system. But still, they see that their lives are improving with the New Deal. And so they're starting to vote Democratic. This is where we get that kind of flip in the American political system. Southern whites are going to start actually thinking twice about the Democratic Party because of this, right? So imagine that. After the Civil War, no Southern white wants to vote Republican. But starting in 1936, we're going to start to see Southern whites migrating towards the Republican Party. It's going to accelerate, and in the 1960s, it's going to get a lot faster, and with the President Richard Nixon, when he runs in 68 and 72, he runs on what's called a Southern strategy, which actually is really targeting Southern whites. And today, the white South tends to vote Republican. Okay, so that's realignment. Now, I mentioned political capital. Franklin Roosevelt seems to have gained a lot of political capital in 1936, and then he immediately blows it. And he does it because of the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court in 1932 and in 1936 is made up of 9 pretty old men, I think all of whom were probably appointed, but no, they weren't all appointed by Republicans, but most of them were appointed by Republicans. None of them were appointed by Franklin Roosevelt. And the Supreme Court has been ruling the New Deal unconstitutional. Out of 9 court cases involving New Deal programs, 7 of those programs have been ruled unconstitutional. Okay? Why? Well, remember, we read the enumerated powers, and nothing in the enumerated powers says that Congress can create a Social Security administration. Nothing says that Congress can pay farmers not to farm. Nothing says that Congress can give out money for unemployment insurance. None of those things are covered in the Constitution, and the Supreme Court is ruling those things unconstitutional. Here's what FDR decides to do. He says, okay, 6 of the members are over the age of 70. Back then, 70 is really, really old, right? I mean, there are plenty of 70-year-olds. One of them's the president. One of them's running for a presidency, who we see them as old. I mean, I do, frankly. But, there's still plenty of 70-year-olds who seem pretty sharp and able, with their experience and their wisdom, to run things. But FDR in 1936 says, no, Congress should give me the power to appoint 1 justice for every current justice over the age of 70. Okay, 6 of them are over the age of 70, and FDR says I should be able to have a Supreme Court of at least 15 people. Now, what would that mean? FDR would appoint 6 new members, and that would give him the majority he needs to keep his bills being ruled constitutional. Okay? This backfires on Franklin Roosevelt. Why? You should know this. What is Roosevelt seeming to mess with here? He's messing with the system of checks and balances. Okay? Has he already assumed a lot of power? Has Congress already been a rubber stamp to him? It has. And people are starting to say, like, whoa, wait a minute. We can't give a president this much power. This is bad. Congress says, no way. We're not letting you take up all this power. This is the time in history where people like Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler are coming to power. Joseph Stalin. We're seeing the rise of dictators all over the world, and the U.S. pulls back and says, FDR might be trying to become a dictator. We can't allow that. So FDR not only does not get his way, this is called the court packing scheme. He does not get his way. It also takes a lot of his New Deal momentum away from him. Congress starts kind of reasserting itself and not letting FDR just do whatever it wants to do. However, here's a really important thing. The court, even though it has not been altered by FDR yet, he's going to be a president for a long time, so he will appoint new justices. But the court, which is still at heart pretty conservative, realizes that they just barely averted a breakdown of the checks and balances of the Constitution. They realize that their rulings against the New Deal are not popular, and that they better start going along with the public will, or else the public might just give in to FDR next time around, right? So some wag said, not a stitch in time. I wrote stitch in time. This is something that Ben Franklin said, right? A stitch in time saves 9. Some commentator said a switch in time saves 9, meaning the Supreme Court all of a sudden starts ruling things constitutional, knowing that they're very popular. And basically, they use the Interstate Commerce Clause to do that. They say, like, oh, well, Social Security is really a part of the interstate commerce, and they start making this switch. Now, there are some jurists, that is, judges today, who believe that ever since 1937, when that switch happened, that the U.S. Congress has been creating unconstitutional laws that need to go away. At least 2 of these jurists who believe this are sitting on the Supreme Court today. So think about that. Think about if the Supreme Court all of a sudden said Social Security was unconstitutional or unemployment relief was unconstitutional. That would be pretty crazy. But we shall see. Anyway, that's the court packing scheme. In 1937, we get a downturn in the economy again. We're still not out of the Depression. Things get a little bit better, but in 1937, we have what's called the Roosevelt recession. The economy, which is just getting a little bit better, plummets again. People think there's maybe two big reasons. One, Social Security has created new taxes. New taxes tend to hurt economic growth because instead of spending that money, you're paying more to the federal government. Also, at this point, FDR is still worried about government deficits. And he sees that he's spending all this money that the government is borrowing, and he decides to cut back. And that is also, gets rid of a stimulus to the economy. After 1937, FDR embraces what's called Keynesian economics. This is based on the theories of the British economist John Maynard Keynes. Here's the basic idea. Keynes says when there is a depression or a recession, governments need to step in, borrow a ton of money, and spend that money to stimulate the economy. Okay? So, for instance, the national debt in 1932 was $19 billion. By 1939, it's $40 billion. Imagine that. The U.S. government is spending about $20 billion during the Great Depression to try to get the country out of the Depression. The country doesn't get out of the Depression, really. It gets better, but it's World War II that finally ends the Depression. Okay? And World War II is just another huge opportunity for the federal government to spend a lot of money. This time it's going to spend money on aircraft carriers and tanks and airplanes and guns and bullets. Okay? And the U.S. economy booms. Obviously, because of the war, unemployment goes way down. The U.S. government is going to draft, I think, close to 16 million men over the 4 years that we fight World War II. And that really is going to end the Depression. But still, think about this. The U.S. government has just spent a couple $1 trillion trying to keep the economy afloat today because of the pandemic. Remember when we looked at that federal deficit clock? It was at about $20 trillion, right? And it was rising steadily. Well, that clock is now at about $25 trillion, I think. That's frightening. It's painful. But on the other hand, if that's the only way we can keep the economy going, that's probably a good thing. What should we do once we get out of this problem? We should pay that money back. Will we? That's the problem with Keynesian economics. Politicians love to spend money, but they don't love to raise taxes because that tends to make people angry. So that's a lot, and I went pretty quick. I know that you don't like that I've been giving long lectures. So hopefully we can use our time on Wednesday to discuss some of these things in more detail. And remember, we'll have a quiz on this material after our class on Wednesday. All right, thanks everyone. Have a great day.